She was lying in her casket with a smile on her face. Not the peaceful expression that funeral homes arrange on the faces of the people they prepare. Not the absence of pain that sometimes settles on a face after a long illness. A real smile. The kind that belongs to someone who knows something. The kind that belongs to someone who has just finished doing something they are deeply satisfied with and is completely at peace with every part of it. The people in that room had known Eleanor Voss for decades. Her daughter had known her for 37 years. Her best friend had known her for 30. Not one of them had called ahead to ask for that smile. Not one of them had placed it there. And when the lawyer stood up from his chair at the back of the room and said he had something to read on Eleanor's behalf, every single person in that room stopped breathing for just a moment. Because something in the air had already told them that what they were about to hear was going to change the way they understood every year they had ever spent inside Eleanor's love. They were right, and by the time he finished reading, there was not a single person in that room who was not asking themselves the same question. How did we not see it? How did we not understand all the years we were standing inside it, exactly how large it was? The answer to that question is the story I am about to tell you. And I promise you that by the time we reach the end of it, you will never look at the quiet people in your life the same way again. Eleanor Voss was 61 years old when she passed away on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, in the same house she had lived in for 34 years, in the same bed where she had slept every night since the year her daughter was born. She had known she was dying for 14 months. She had told almost nobody, not because she was afraid, not because she was in denial, but because Eleanor Voss had spent those 14 months doing something that nobody in that funeral room knew about until the moment the lawyer stood up and began to read. Something that required privacy to complete. Something that required her to work in silence, the way she had always worked at the things that mattered most to her, without announcement, without witnesses, without anyone looking over her shoulder and asking questions she was not yet ready to answer. She had 14 months. She knew exactly what she needed to do with them, and she did all of it. Every single thing. Right down to the photograph. The photograph her daughter had chosen for the easel at the front of the room because it was the one where Eleanor looked most like herself. The one where she was smiling. Eleanor had known that photograph would be chosen. She had known because she knew her daughter, and she knew which photograph her daughter would reach for on the worst morning of her life. She had been smiling in it for a reason. She had been smiling at something specific. Something only she knew. Something the room was about to find out. To understand what Eleanor planned, you first have to understand who Eleanor was. And to understand who Eleanor was, you have to start at the beginning of her, not the end. Eleanor grew up the second of 4 children in a working-class household in a small American city where everybody knew everybody's business and privacy was something you either constructed carefully or surrendered entirely. Her mother was a practical woman who expressed love through action rather than language. Through meals prepared before anyone asked. Through clothes mended in the night so they were ready by morning. Through a house kept orderly against the specific beautiful chaos of raising 4 children on one income. Her father was a quiet man whose quietness was not coldness but depth. The kind of man who listened more than he spoke. Who sat with things before responding to them. Who, when he did speak, said things worth having heard. Eleanor inherited both of these qualities in equal measure and in full force. She was practical in the way her mother was practical. Deeply and usefully, and without complaint or expectation of recognition. And she was quiet in the way her father was quiet, attentive and unhurried and full of a depth that people sometimes mistook for reserve until they knew her well enough to understand that what they had been reading as distance was actually the opposite. Eleanor was not distant from the people she loved. She was closer to them than they knew. She had always been closer than they knew. That was the thing about Eleanor. She paid attention to everything, to everyone, always, and she remembered what she saw. She married Thomas Voss when she was 26 years old. Thomas was a carpenter, a man who built things with his hands and who approached the world with the same patience and precision he brought to his work. He measured twice. He cut once. He did not rush the things that deserve time. He was not a complicated man. He was a good one. And Eleanor, who had grown up watching her parents build a life out of ordinary materials and extraordinary devotion, recognized goodness when she encountered it and did not make the mistake that so many young people make of undervaluing it because it arrived quietly rather than dramatically. They built a life together in the specific, unhurried way that certain people build lives. Without drama, without announcement, brick by careful brick, year by careful year, in a house on a street in a neighborhood where their names became known not because they sought attention but because they were consistently, reliably, genuinely there. They had one child together, a daughter named Claire, who arrived when Eleanor was 29, and who became from the moment of her first breath the organizing principle of Eleanor's entire interior world. Not in the way that some parents lose themselves in their children, dissolving so completely into the role that they forget who they were before it, but in the way that certain parents love, with a completeness that does not diminish the self but expands it, that asks nothing from the child in return and gives everything available without keeping score. Eleanor loved Claire the way her father had loved quietly and her mother had loved practically, which meant she loved her in every possible dimension simultaneously and said almost none of it out loud. Claire grew up inside that love the way people grow up inside air. Necessary. Invisible. Something you only begin to understand the dimensions of when it is no longer simply surrounding you. Thomas Voss died of a sudden illness when Claire was 19 and Eleanor was 48. It was the kind of loss that arrives without warning and reorganizes everything. The kind that does not give you time to prepare a response because preparation was never an option in grief. The real kind does not wait for anyone to be ready for it. Eleanor grieved Thomas with the same quietness she had brought to loving him. Privately, completely, without performing it for an audience she did not have and would not have sought. She did not fall apart in ways that were visible to the world. She continued to go to work. She continued to maintain the house. She continued to show up for Claire, who was 19 and in her first year of college, and who needed her mother to still be her mother, even while her mother was also a woman who had just lost the person she had spent 22 years building her life beside. Eleanor was both of those things simultaneously. She always was. The woman who needed and the woman who gave. Holding both without letting either consume the other. That was the part of Eleanor that the people who loved her most were slowest to fully see, because it was the part she worked hardest to make look effortless. It was not effortless. It never had been. It was the sustained daily work of a woman who had decided, somewhere in the architecture of her character, that the people around her deserved her full presence even on the days when her full presence cost her something significant to give. After Thomas died, Eleanor reorganized her life around two things. Her work, which she had always taken seriously and which she continued to take seriously because seriousness about work had always been one of her primary expressions of self-respect. And Claire. Not in the hovering way of a grieving parent who redirects all their emotional energy at their remaining family member until that family member buckles under the weight of being someone's entire world. But in the specific quiet way of a woman who understood that the most important thing she could do for her daughter in the years after Thomas died was to model what it looked like to survive loss without being destroyed by it. To continue. To show up. To build rather than contract. Eleanor built. She kept the house. She kept her job. She kept her friendships, maintained carefully and without fanfare, in the way Eleanor maintained everything. She kept her garden, which Thomas had started in the second year of their marriage and which Eleanor continued after he died, not out of obligation or sentimentality but out of the specific love that attaches itself to the things a person we have lost cared about. She grew things in that garden for 13 years after Thomas died. Tomatoes and herbs and seasonal flowers that she cut and arranged and gave to her neighbors without being asked and without making a production of the giving. She never mentioned that the garden had been Thomas's idea. She just kept growing things and giving them away. That was Eleanor. The action without the announcement. The love without the accounting. Claire grew up and built her own life. She married a man named Daniel when she was 27. A kind and steady man who reminded Eleanor, in the specific ways that matter most, of Thomas. Not in appearance or profession, but in the quality of his attention to Claire. The way he showed up for her. The way he listened when she spoke. The way he treated the ordinary days of their life together with the specific attentiveness of a man who understood that the ordinary days were where the real thing lived. Eleanor approved of Daniel not loudly or with ceremony, but in the way she approved of everything she approved of, through the specific warmth of her presence, through the particular quality of her engagement with him at family dinners, through the way she began over the years to include him in the quiet circle of people she grew things for. Daniel knew he had been accepted into Eleanor's innermost circle. Claire and Daniel had 2 children together. A boy named Marcus who was 8 years old when Eleanor died, and a girl named Sophie who was 5. Eleanor was the kind of grandmother who showed up. Not occasionally, and not when it was convenient, and not with the performance of grandmotherly love that some people mistake for the actual thing. She showed up consistently, reliably, every week, in the specific way that children register presence without being able to articulate what it gives them or what its absence would cost them. She attended every school event she was told about, and several she found out about by asking Marcus and Sophie directly, because she understood that children sometimes forget to tell their parents things that matter, and she had made it her personal business to ask. She taught Sophie how to plant seeds in the small patch of garden she had sectioned off specifically for Sophie's use, marked with a small wooden sign that said Sophie's Garden in Eleanor's handwriting. She taught Marcus how to make the specific bread recipe that had been her mother's and her mother's mother's, and that Eleanor had been making every Sunday for 40 years. She told both of them stories, not from books but from her own life, edited carefully for age appropriateness but never condescending, never simplified beyond recognition into something a child would see through. She treated them as people. Small people who would become larger people, but people whose inner lives deserved to be taken seriously. They adored her, in the specific unconditional way that children adore people who make them feel genuinely seen in a world that does not always stop long enough to look. Eleanor was diagnosed 14 months before she died. The diagnosis was serious and the prognosis was honest, and Eleanor, who had never been a woman who looked away from difficult truths when looking away was the more comfortable option, received both the diagnosis and the prognosis with the quiet composure that had always been her primary response to things she could not change. She asked the doctor the questions that needed to be asked. She listened to the answers with full attention. She thanked the doctor. She drove home alone. She sat in her kitchen, the kitchen where she had made Thomas's coffee every morning for 22 years and Marcus's bread every Sunday for the past 3 years, and countless dinners and countless cups of tea. And she made herself a cup of tea, and she sat with what she had been told for a very long time. She did not call Claire that night. She did not call anyone that night. She sat with the information, and she began, in the specific methodical way of a woman who had always approached difficulty as something to be organized rather than simply endured, to make a plan. Not a plan for herself. Eleanor had never spent much time on plans for herself. A plan for the people she was going to leave. A plan for what they were going to need after she was gone. A plan built on 14 months of observation and 30 years of paying attention and 61 years of understanding, more completely than anyone around her had ever fully realized, exactly who the people she loved were and what they needed and what they were capable of if someone simply cleared the road. The plan took all 14 months to execute. Nobody knew the full scope of it. Not Claire. Not Daniel. Not Eleanor's closest friend Margaret, who had known Eleanor for 30 years, and who would later say in the weeks after the funeral that she had sensed Eleanor was keeping something but had not understood until the lawyer began to read that the something Eleanor was keeping was this large, this carefully constructed, this complete. Margaret had known Eleanor was ill because Eleanor had told her that much. Margaret had noticed something was wrong and had asked directly, and Eleanor had never been a liar. But Eleanor had not told Margaret what she was doing with the time. She had not told anyone what she was doing with the time. She had simply done it. Quietly. Methodically. Over 14 months. Rising early when the rest of the world was still asleep and working on the plan in the specific privacy of early mornings that belonged to nobody but the person awake enough to use them. She made phone calls. She visited offices. She wrote letters. She recorded herself speaking. She contacted specialists and planners and a lawyer she had chosen carefully and met with 3 times before she was satisfied that he understood not just what she wanted done but why she wanted it done and how she wanted it received. She paid attention to every detail the way she had always paid attention to every detail of everything she cared about. And when it was finished, when every piece of it was in place and every envelope was sealed and every arrangement was confirmed, she sat in her kitchen one last time and she made herself a cup of tea and she felt, in the specific deep way of a person who has finished something important, at peace, complete, ready. And 3 weeks before she died, Eleanor sat in her garden with the October light falling across her face and she smiled. Not because someone told her to, not because the moment called for it, but because she knew. She had already done everything. And the knowing of that, the complete and certain knowing, was the most peaceful thing she had ever felt in her life. What Eleanor had done in those 14 months was this. She had taken every significant relationship of her life and she had thought carefully, specifically, and without sentimentality about what each person needed that they might not be able to give themselves. Not what they wanted. Not what would make them feel good in the short term. What they needed in the deep and particular sense of what would allow them to become more fully themselves. There is a difference between what people want and what people need that most of us never take the time to identify clearly, partly because the identification requires a quality of attention that most of us never sustain long enough and partly because the answer, once identified, often requires us to give something we did not plan to give. Eleanor had taken that time. She had sustained that attention. And the answers she had arrived at were specific and intimate, and in some cases surprising to the people who received them because the people who received them had not known they were being watched that carefully. They had not known that Eleanor had been carrying their unspoken needs alongside her own for years. They had not known how much she had seen. They were about to find out. For Claire, she had done something that Claire would not discover until the lawyer began to read, and even then would take several days to fully absorb. Eleanor had known, in the way that mothers know the things their children never say directly, that Claire had wanted for years to return to painting. Claire had been a painter in her early 20s, before Marcus was born and life had reorganized itself around the beautiful urgent priority of a new child. She had put her canvases and her brushes in a storage unit 8 years ago and had not opened that storage unit since. She had never told Eleanor she missed it. She had never said out loud that there was a part of herself sitting in that storage unit alongside the canvases. Waiting. She had not needed to say it. Eleanor had seen it in her eyes every time they passed a gallery window. She had heard it in the specific quality of silence that fell over Claire at certain moments, the silence of someone who is in proximity to something they have given up and have not yet made peace with giving up. Eleanor had been carrying that observation for 8 years without saying anything because Claire had not asked and Eleanor had not offered, and that was the agreement between them. But now Eleanor was arranging things. And the arrangement she had made for Claire was specific and complete and funded by 14 months of careful financial planning conducted in absolute privacy. She had set aside enough to give Claire 3 years. 3 years in which Claire would not need to work the job she had been working. 3 years in which the household bills would be covered and Marcus and Sophie's school costs would be paid and Daniel's income would be supplemented enough that Claire's absence from her salary would not put pressure on the family. 3 years in which Claire could unlock that storage unit and pick up a brush and find out whether the painter she had been at 22 was still living inside the woman she was at 37. 3 years. Arranged quietly. Funded completely. Given by a woman who would not be there to see what Claire did with them but who had absolute faith. Born of 8 years of watching her daughter's eyes near gallery windows. That Claire would do something real with the time. Something true. Something that belonged entirely to her. For Marcus she had written letters. Not 1 letter. 8 letters. 1 to be opened on each birthday going forward until he was 16. The lawyer had them in a wooden box. Each letter was sealed and dated in Eleanor's handwriting on the specific cream-colored stationery she had used for important correspondence her entire adult life. Each letter contained what Eleanor had observed about Marcus in the years she had known him, what she loved about who he was becoming, what she hoped for him in the specific year ahead. and one piece of something she had learned in her own life that she believed would be useful to him at precisely that age. Not general wisdom. Not things people say to children because they sound right. Specific things. Earned things. Things that had come from Eleanor's own experience of being alive and paying attention for 61 years, distilled and addressed specifically to a boy who was going to become a man in the years that followed and who was going to need, at each stage of that becoming, something more than what the ordinary world reliably offered. She had thought carefully about each letter. She had written each one more than once. The final versions were the versions where she had removed everything that was for her and kept only what was for him. The wooden box sat on the table in front of Claire during the reading, and Marcus sat beside his mother and looked at it with the specific wide-eyed stillness of an 8-year-old who understands that something important has just entered his life in a form he has not encountered before. He would understand more each year. Eleanor had counted on that. She had built the letters to grow with him, to mean different things at different ages, to be the kind of thing he would want to read again when he was older and would find, each time he reread them, that they had more in him than they had the time before. That was how Eleanor had written them. With the patience of a woman who understood that good things deepen rather than diminish with time. For Sophie, she had done something different. Sophie was 5, and 5-year-olds need different things than 8-year-olds need, and Eleanor had understood this completely and had planned accordingly. For Sophie, she had recorded herself. Not a single recording but many, gathered over the final months of her life in the specific privacy of her kitchen on Tuesday afternoons when she knew the house was empty and the neighborhood was quiet, and she had the time and the stillness and the specific quality of attention that the recordings required. She had sat at her kitchen table with a small recording device, and she had talked to Sophie. The way she would have talked to her in person over the years that were not going to happen. She had told Sophie stories from her own life, from Eleanor's life, the stories of where their family had come from and what it had looked like to be young and uncertain and figuring out what kind of person you wanted to be. She had told Sophie about Thomas, the grandfather Sophie had never met, and what kind of man he had been and why Eleanor had chosen him, and what their life together had taught her about what love actually looks like when it is real rather than performed. She had told Sophie about the garden and why she had kept it going for 13 years after Thomas died, and what growing things had come to mean to her, and why she hoped Sophie would keep tending the small patch with the wooden sign that said Sophie's Garden. She had recorded hours of herself speaking in the ordinary, unhurried voice of a woman talking to someone she loves. With no script and no performance, just Eleanor being Eleanor, the way she had always been Eleanor, paying attention and saying the true thing in the quiet way and trusting that it would be received. The second wooden box was identical to Marcus's, and it sat beside the first one on the table during the reading, and Sophie was asleep against her father's arm when the lawyer described what was inside it, and Daniel looked down at his sleeping daughter, and his expression was the expression of a man who has just understood something about the woman he had loved as a mother-in-law that he had not previously understood, and that was going to take him a long time to fully absorb. On the outside of Sophie's box, in Eleanor's handwriting, a note was taped. It said, "I knew you would want to hear my voice, so here it is. All of it. Take as much time as you need. I am not going anywhere." For Margaret, Eleanor's oldest and closest friend of 30 years, Eleanor had known that Margaret had a dream she had talked about for decades and never pursued. A journey to a country her own grandmother had emigrated from. A place Margaret had always said she would visit someday. A someday that had been postponed for 30 years by the ordinary competing urgencies of a full life. Eleanor had made the someday into a specific date. She had contacted a travel specialist. She had researched the precise region that Margaret's grandmother had come from. She had arranged and fully paid for a detailed trip including flights and accommodation and a local guide and a researcher who specialized in helping people trace their family histories in that specific region, finding the records and the places and the stories that connected the living to the people who came before them. She had put everything into an envelope with Margaret's name on it and given it to the lawyer with specific instructions that it be presented at the funeral. Because Eleanor had known, with the complete certainty of a woman who had been paying attention to her best friend for 30 years, that Margaret was going to need something to look forward to on the day she said goodbye. And she had arranged for the looking forward to be ready and waiting in the lawyer's bag before Margaret even knew she needed it. The lawyer finished reading. He closed the folder in front of him, and he set his pen down on the table, and he sat back in his chair, and the room was silent in a way that rooms are very rarely silent. Not the silence of people who have nothing to say. The silence of people who have been so completely and unexpectedly surprised by what they have just heard that the ordinary mechanisms of response have temporarily stopped working. People looked at each other. People looked at the photograph. Claire was holding the wooden box with both hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the lid without opening it yet. The way you hold something precious when you are not quite ready for what is inside it. Daniel had his arm around her, and his face was doing something that was not quite crying but lived in the immediate neighborhood of it. Marcus was sitting very straight and very still in the way that 8-year-olds sit when they understand that something large has just happened, even if they cannot yet name all its dimensions. Sophie was asleep against her father's arm, peaceful and completely unaware, growing into the wooden box beside her in real time without knowing it. Margaret was holding the envelope with both hands and looking at Eleanor's photograph with the expression of a woman who has known someone for 30 years and has just discovered that she did not know the full size of them. That the person she thought she knew completely was even larger inside than she had ever measured. That the love she had received from Eleanor for 3 decades had been even more deliberate and even more specific than she had understood while she was inside it. And then Margaret said something, quietly, not for the room exactly and not for herself exactly, but perhaps for Eleanor, who was not in the room and was also, in the specific way of people who have arranged things so carefully that their presence is felt in every arrangement, entirely and unmistakably present. She looked at the photograph and she said it again, softer. She knew everything she needed to do, and she did all of it. And the smile in the photograph looked back at her. The smile of a woman who had spent 14 months doing the most important work of her life in the most complete privacy. The smile of a woman who had looked at the time remaining to her and had decided, with the full clarity that comes to people who have stopped pretending that time is unlimited, that she was going to spend every remaining moment of it the way she had spent the best moments of her whole life. Paying attention, making arrangements, giving things to the people she loved that they did not know they needed and that she would not be there to see received but that she trusted, with the absolute faith of someone who had spent 61 years learning how to love properly, they were going to need. The smile of a woman who had finished, who had done everything, who was at peace with every arrangement she had made and every letter she had sealed and every recording she had left and every trip she had planned and every key she had placed and every basket of tomatoes left on a car hood without a note. She had arranged it all. She had done it all. Claire went home that evening with the wooden box in her arms, and the weight of everything it contained and the separate and equally enormous weight of the envelope from the lawyer that held the financial arrangements Eleanor had made for the 3 years ahead. She held the box in her lap, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about the storage unit, and she thought about the brushes she had not touched in 8 years and the canvases wrapped in cloth that had been sitting in the dark waiting with the specific patience of objects that belong to the life of someone who has not yet returned to claim them. She thought about the photograph on the easel at the front of the room, the smile, the October light, the garden. She thought about how many times she had sat in this kitchen with her mother and talked about everything except the painting. How many times Eleanor had listened and asked questions and responded, "I know what you gave up. I know what is sitting in that storage unit. I know what you are going to do when you are ready." She went to the drawer where she kept miscellaneous keys. She found the key to the storage unit. She held it in her hand for a moment, the small specific weight of it, a key to a room that held a version of herself she had thought she had put away permanently. She carried it back to the kitchen and she placed it on the counter where she would see it every morning. And the next morning when she came downstairs, it was the first thing she saw. The key on the counter. And her mother's voice somewhere inside her saying the thing Eleanor had written in the note. The thing that Claire had not yet read but was going to read later that day when she finally opened the envelope. "I have always known you were a painter. I have always known you would find your way back to it. I am just making sure the road is clear. The world is full of people who love. But the world is not equally full of people who love the way Eleanor Voss loved, with that particular combination of attention and patience and complete absence of self-interest that turns ordinary love into something that outlasts the person giving it. Most of us love with conditions we do not always acknowledge. We love and we keep score, not maliciously but humanly, in the way that love and expectation tend to tangle together when they occupy the same heart for long enough. We love and we want to be thanked. We love and we want to be seen loving. We love and we hope that the love will be returned in the specific form in which it was given. Eleanor Voss loved without any of those conditions attached. She loved and she paid attention and she made arrangements and she let the arrangements speak for themselves after she was gone. She left gifts that nobody had asked for in forms nobody had anticipated for needs nobody had articulated out loud. She left them wrapped in the specific privacy of a woman who had spent her whole life giving without the giving being the point. For Eleanor, the giving was never the point. The receiving was the point, not her receiving. The moment Claire stood in the storage unit again with a brush in her hand. The moment Marcus opened the first letter on the first birthday. The moment Sophie, at 7 or 9 or 13 or whenever she was ready, pressed play on the first recording and heard her grandmother's voice speaking directly to her from a kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon as if she had simply sat down with a cup of tea and decided to talk. The moment Margaret stood in the country her grandmother had come from and understood, for the first time through something more than photographs and stories, where she had come from and therefore who she had always been. Those moments, that was what Eleanor was arranging, not her own legacy, not to be remembered as generous or extraordinary or remarkable. Those moments specifically and individually, for each of them. That was the whole point. It had always been the whole point. Eleanor Voss understood something that most of us spend our entire lives approaching without quite reaching. That the most powerful thing you can give the people you love is not your presence. Though your presence is precious and irreplaceable and its absence is a wound that does not fully heal. The most powerful thing you can give the people you love is evidence that you saw them. That you watched carefully and long enough and with enough patience and enough love to understand not just who they are but who they are trying to become. That the love you held for them was specific to them and not interchangeable and not the kind that could have been given to anyone but the kind that was given to them because of exactly who they were and what they needed and what they were capable of if someone who loved them completely simply cleared the road and stepped back and let them walk it. Eleanor cleared roads. For all of them. Over decades of quiet attention and 14 months of quiet work. There is a question that this story leaves with everyone who sits with it long enough, and it is not a complicated question, but it is not an easy one either. The question is this. The people in your life who love you most quietly, do you see them? Not in the general way of knowing they are present and being glad they are present, but in the specific way of understanding what they are actually doing when they love you. How much they are paying attention. How much they have understood about you that you have never said out loud. How much they are carrying alongside their own lives that they have never once asked you to acknowledge. Eleanor Voss loved the people in her life for 61 years, and almost none of them understood the full size of what she was doing until the day she was gone. That is not a failure of the people who loved her. It is simply the nature of a certain kind of love. The quiet kind. The question worth asking yourself today, right now, before this video ends and you move on to the next thing your day requires of you, is whether you will need a lawyer and a wooden box and a room gone silent to understand what you have. Or whether you can understand it now. While the person is still here. While the garden is still growing. While there is still time to look at them, the quiet ones. The ones who have been paying attention to you for years without making a production of it. And say simply and directly and without waiting for a funeral to make it necessary. I see you. I see exactly what you have been doing. And it is the most extraordinary thing I have ever been given. If the story reached into something in you that you were not expecting it to reach, leave a comment below. Tell me what you felt. Tell me if there is an Eleanor in your life. Tell me if you are an Eleanor. Tell me where you are watching from because this community is everywhere and I read every single comment and every single one matters to me more than I can say in this space. Before we go any further, please hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story on this channel. Because what we build here at Dopamine Tales is exactly this. Stories about the full and true dimensions of human beings. Stories that do not simplify people or reduce them or make them easier to digest than they actually are. Stories that sit with the complexity and the beauty and the cost of what it actually means to be alive and to love and to lose and to keep going anyway. Stories that leave you with something real that you did not have before you pressed play. That is what this channel is. That is what every story we tell here is for. Subscribe, stay, and bring someone with you who needs to hear what Eleanor knew. This is Dopamine Tales. Feed your mind. Feel every word.